Very good to see you this morning. We want to welcome everybody and be glad that you're here and glad to be together on the first day of the week. And it's good to see each of you and our visitors with us especially. Thank you for coming to be with us today. Probably one of the more familiar scriptures to you is the idea in the Bible of the Christian life being compared to a race. And one of those scriptures that comes up is Hebrews chapter 12. If you'll look with me in that, Hebrews chapter 12, let's look over there in that text, and let's read the opening verses to that text. He begins by saying, "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that's set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." I'm going to take line by line and look at some of the thoughts of that text, and I hope this will be an encouragement to you. I hope it will make you stop and think. What we're involved in is a race. There's a race set before us. As you start in that text, do you notice just he simply says, let us run. Let us run with endurance the race. The race. That word race may not be exactly what you think of when you look at a word like that. You might think, well, it's having something to do with running. But it really goes back to a term that meant a contest. Or the real word in the Greek is agon, just like, you think about words like agonize, or, along that line, agon comes from that word. When we agonize, we kind of, wrestle with something in our hearts and things like that. But the idea of this particular word suggests a conflict, a fight, something that we are running and contesting others, and we're in it to win. In other words, it's something that kind of anticipates that there's going to be a great struggle involved. When you run a race, the race that he's kind of talking about here is the Christian race, and it has to do with the race that we run throughout our lives. It starts when we are immersed in the water of baptism and rise up out of it, and ends when we breathe our last breath on the face of this earth. That's our whole race, and it cannot be anything short of that in our understanding. The race, the very definition of that idea of a race suggests the idea of something that we will have to struggle with, that will require discipline, determination. And as I've heard it explained, this race is like a marathon instead of a sprint. I don't know if you remember in school, if you did any racing or did any, activities like that, or ever watched it, maybe in sports. But there were various races that people, did. There was 50-yard dash, 100-yard dash. There was, maybe a mile around the track. But a marathon is a whole different kind of race. And all of us who've ever watched on TV, perhaps some of you have run a marathon, I don't know. But you know that requires incredible commitment. Because you're running at a distance that's so long and takes such a long time to achieve that it's just going to, it's not going to be something you get over with in a hurry. It's going to take such determination. And we have to understand, I think there are people who think of the Christian life and they're thinking it's a sprint. They think, well, we'll dash, real quick and it'll be over and I'll be through and I'll put forth effort for a short period of time, and now I don't have to do that anymore. Well, that can't be like a Christian's life, because a Christian will go on and on and on and on, and they'll get very tired. And sometimes it will be a struggle to be a Christian. I want us to remember, too, about the race, that it's not an individual thing. When he says, let us run the race set before us, I think it's important to remember this isn't an isolated race. I mean, we are running with others. The point of the race is not let me win against you. The point of the race is for us all to cross the finish line. The point of the race is for us all to stay with it until we get there. You know, there are passages in Hebrews, that same chapter. He says, see to it that no one falls short of the grace of God. It's a little later on in the same text. See to it. That word, see to it, it's the same word that describes the idea of an elder of the church, an overseer. In the Greek language, it means the same thing as the idea of oversight or the bishop, because it suggests the idea of looking over the situation and making sure. When he says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, he's saying, in other words, be certain. And I think he's saying we all have this responsibility. We're all kind of in the process of cheering one another on and encouraging one another to finish the race. We don't need to think of it as just me involved with this, but all of us involved in it. And may I remind you, when he talks about this, he calls it the race that's set before us. May I just briefly explain that this is not the race of your choosing or my choosing. This is the race that we have decided to enter at the Lord's choosing. Let's run the race, this race that's set before us. And it's not my course that I want to go, but it's the course that has been marked out for us by the Lord Jesus Christ. We're going to see a little bit later on, I'll explain a little bit more what he means. But he calls Jesus the author and finisher of our race, our faith. And we'll look at that, but you understand that Jesus set that course. We have to first off realize, as he starts this text, he explains that there are many witnesses that ought to be encouraging us to run this race, that ought to be of encouragement to us. The cloud of witnesses, he calls them. He says we have so great a cloud of witnesses. It's kind of like he pictures it. And I've always thought of it this way, whether that's what his original intention was or not. But have you ever watched as somebody ran into a stadium and you look up in that stadium and there's just a sea of faces, as we've all seen on, if we've been there or on television, just in any kind of stadium. Down there below, when you look up, it's just this grand number of people all around. Some of the running stadiums that they had back in that day and time were not like a big baseball or football stadium. It was relatively narrow, the track that they came running into, and so you were even closer up to the runner. Here were all of this sea of people around you. And I kind of think of that when he talks about this cloud of witnesses. Because when you look up, you see from God's perspective and from God's word, you see a cloud of witnesses that have gone before us. Now, these aren't spectators, but these are people that ran the race, finished their race, and took their place in the cheering section, you might say. Amen. They've gone up there. Now, you might say, what are you talking about? What's he talking about in this text? Who are that cloud of witnesses? Well, Hebrews chapter 11, if you backed up, we won't take the time to read it, but if you backed up over to that, he describes the cloud of witnesses. Matter of fact, did you see the very first word in Hebrews chapter 12 is, therefore? Okay, that always connects you back with what he's been talking about. Therefore, since we have that great cloud of witnesses, well, when you go back to chapter 11, he just got through talking about all those witnesses. And he said Abel was one of those witnesses. And he said Enoch was one of those witnesses. And he said Noah was one of those people. And he said that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah, they were some of those people from that time. And he goes on down, and he doesn't try to cover everybody in the Old Testament because he doesn't have time to deal with everybody that you might imagine, but he goes along discussing all these different people, and he kind of gets us just about, through Moses' time and the fall of the walls of Jericho and Joshua, and he mentions David briefly, and then he kind of goes into a quick series of people that he doesn't necessarily name, but he just goes on and talks about various people that went through various things to win their race. But the point about them is they all operated by faith, they all endured, and they all won. And that's what we want to get out of that. I think he's trying to set the stage for us. Again, not to bore you with the illustration, but if you thought in terms of running a marathon, you're going to sweat, your side is going to ache, your legs are going to cramp, you're going to hurt as you run this race. This is not something that's simple and gentle and all pleasant. It's something that's incredibly challenging. Now, he talks about some of these people. Some of the things that he mentions in Hebrews is dynamic and exciting. He talks about women who were able to conceive by faith, even though they had been barren for a period of time. He talks about men who are able to stop the mouths of lions. He talks about all those exciting stories that we like in the Bible and that children study and that we discuss with them. But there's another side to this, and he lists several faithful who ran the race and they finished their race. And the people that we were mentioning there that he's saying, in other words, they ran their race. It got hard at times, but now you need to run your race, Christian, and you need to finish it like they did. And what you begin to realize is, he says in Hebrews 11:35, that all of it was not a happy ending. Some were tortured. Some refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection, verse 35 says. And then dropping down a little bit further at verse 36 through 38, some faced jeers and flogging, while others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. There was a belief among the Jews, and evidently this substantiates that at least to somebody, but that Isaiah was actually cut in half. The Bible doesn't ever spell that out or say that, but it's possible that there were some things that were true that were handed down that the Bible just doesn't happen to mention. But that Isaiah may have been cut in half while he was still alive, in other words. They were sawn in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins. I kind of think about, although that doesn't exactly describe him, but even John the Baptist or someone like that, what he went through. They were destitute. They were persecuted. They were mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and in holes in the ground. Those are not pleasant things. Those aren't happy things. That's not, that's not the exciting things like you read about. That's not even like being saved in an ark, from the flood. That's getting hurt. That's suffering. That's going through hard times. Nevertheless, he's saying that ought to encourage us. That cloud of witnesses ought to mean something to us and suggest something to us. The great cloud of witnesses testifies to us. They are witnesses in the sense that they are testifying, in other words, look, this was hard, but we did it. This was a challenge, but we went through it. This was something that put us through difficult days while upon this earth, but we ended up victorious because we ended up as people of faith that held to their faith through all of those times. Now, on this basis, and keep in mind that's how he starts, really, Hebrews chapter 12 at verse 1, he also says this, You and I, as Christians then, on the basis of thinking about these kind of people and others who ran their race, he said we have to be willing to lay aside the things that encumber us. We can all understand that in the process of running, that you can't have much that's going to interfere with that. Lay aside the things that encumber you. This term means, first off, the idea of anything that's bulky or kind of massive in nature. And he says, as he defined that, it went on to suggest the idea that it becomes to you a burden, a weight that kind of entangles you or encumbers you and keeps you from running, either because, it's so bulky that it kind of gets in your way, or because it's so heavy that it weights you down. You're familiar with these passages that talk about girding yourself up in the New Testament. Girding up. Peter has the famous one, gird up the loins of your mind, which you really have a spot up there in your mind to gird, but it makes a point. And in that day and time, what the man did, he'd wear this tunic, and I guess a woman too, if she was going to have to move about quickly, but he took his garment up without being necessarily immodest, but he took it up and tucked it in his belt. And that girded up your loins. In other words, that kept all of that from encumbering you. So if you got a lot of work to do, if you're having to run or go fast or whatever, you girded that up so that it did not encumber you. And the Lord is telling us here that we've got to get rid of those things which weight us down or entangle us or encumber us. Here's something Jesus said. He said, be careful, or your hearts will be weighted down. Be careful, or your hearts will be weighted down with dissipation, or drunkenness, or the anxieties of life. And that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap. Some believe he's talking right there about the destruction of Jerusalem, but you could see how that could also apply to the coming of the Lord. And he said, what if we had allowed ourselves to slip into intoxication, and we were going about, either because of drugs or alcohol or whatever, and we were going about most of the time without really thinking much about anything, but our minds were just kind of in a fog, and we were just maneuvering through life, getting done the little bit that we were trying to get done, but not thinking about our souls. What happens if your life is weighted down? I know that word dissipation's a little hard, but it suggests the idea of a lostness to our life. It's the same idea, I've been told, as the prodigal son in his sinful days. That what had happened to his life, it had gone into dissipation, where he had wasted it on drunkenness and harlots and all the rest. He gave his life over to those sinful kind of things. What's going to happen to us if we're weighted down with that? Or drunkenness, or even just the anxieties of life. All the things that confront us in life that weight us down, and we've got to go do this, and we've got to go do this, and we've got our responsibilities over here, and all of these different things are weighting us down so that day close that up on you like a trap. In other words, instead of the day of the Lord being a great day coming, it's a sad day coming, because it's going to catch us, and we won't be expecting it, and we won't be prepared for it, because we will have been burdened down. And part of running our race is about the business of getting unburdened. And boy, I tell you, what that takes is some real guts on the part of a Christian that looks at the events of life and says to children or to friends or to work or whatever it may be, and says, we'll have to work that around my schedule of worship and activity for the Lord. See, some people do it just the opposite. Church has to work around all the other things they choose to do. But when we get rid of these weights that entangle us, he says we have to put everything else aside so that we can do what the Lord said. If you talk about somebody literally running, there's a woman that was having to run. That was Lot's wife. She and Lot were having to get out of Sodom in a hurry, weren't they? We remember the story in the very brief scripture where Jesus actually spoke it, and he said, remember Lot's wife. something about Lot's wife, and we don't know the whole story. I mean, it doesn't tell us everything about it, but something within her said, there's something back there I'm concerned about. And what they had kept warning the angel, they even had a little trouble getting Lot to wake up, said he had to take him by the hand, literally, and drag him out of the city. But they kept thinking about things that were there. And finally, I guess Lot was willing to go. But there was something in her that made her kind of want to turn around and think about that back there. And I don't know what was drawing her attention to that. She had her daughters out of there, but there were things back there she looked towards. And when she looked back, and we know that it says she turned into a pillar of salt because the Lord had said, don't look back. You know, one of the last things Paul ever wrote in the last chapter of his writing says, Demas has forsaken me because he loved this present world. Something in Demas looked back. He had been a helper of Paul. He had worked for the cause of Christ. But something had happened to Demas to make him look back to the world and say, no, those are things that I want back there. And it kept him from progressing on to what he should be. You know, there's an important question that we kind of have to ask ourselves, and that is, does this course of action, does this thing I'm about to do, does this decision I'm about to make, is that going to help me win my race of faith, or is it going to hinder that? It's a serious question. And it really ought to be asked about many things that we do. Another thing that he says, it's kind of similar to what we were just talking about, but he says we have to lay aside everything that entangles us, the sin that so easily entangles us. And you know, he mentions several things in the book of Hebrews. He talks about that some had been engaging in the sin of sexual immorality. He said, see to it that no one is sexually immoral. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16. But that's going to entangle you from finishing where you need to be in your race. We have a lot of temptation in that direction in this day and time. I guess it's always been around, but it seems to be ever prevalent in the Lord's church and in our effect the world is having upon us. We also read about in the book of Hebrews that some, he says, were developing an unbelieving heart. He compares them to the people in Old Testament times in the wilderness wandering. So see to it, brothers, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. We always need to remember, folks, that an unbelieving heart is not a heart that quits believing in God, but it quits believing God. There's a difference. The sinful, unbelieving heart quits believing God. It quits believing what God says. It quits believing God's promises. It quits believing God's warnings. And it turns away from the living God. Those people back in the wilderness wanderings that turned away, they didn't necessarily quit believing in a God. They quit believing that it was worth doing what he said. That was their trouble. And then a third thing we read in the book of Hebrews is about the problem of covetousness. And he says, make certain that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. Things like this and a lot of other things can burden us down in this life. I think that's why Jesus makes this comment in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. Come unto me, all ye that are weary and are burdened, heavy laden. The idea is that you got a heavy load on you, and I will give you rest, because he's saying, why don't you just put that down? Take up my yoke, because it's light. It's easy. What I'll ask you to carry will be a whole lot easier than these other things that you've been carting around and are so heavy all the time upon your life. Take my yoke upon you. Also think about what he said in John chapter 8. He said, if the Son makes you free, you'll be free indeed. You'll be free from these burdens. I can get these off your back, but you're going to have to listen to me as to what you need to do. Then he talks about running. This comes again from this text where he talks about running the race. And he made clear about running that race. He said, let's run with endurance the race that's set before us. Let's run with the degree of endurance. And that idea of endurance suggests the concept of perseverance. Verse 3, he goes on to say, you've got to stop and consider Jesus and how he endured. He endured hostility against him. And then at verse 7, he says we've got to endure hardship as discipline. We've got to be willing to endure difficulties and understand that will help to discipline our hearts and help us to learn more about what God would have us to do. Let me tell you, brethren and friends, the word endurance, we look at that, it carries with it these three ideas. Patience, and that is the ability to put up with and stay with something. Steadfastness, the ability to keep going and not give up. And constancy, and that is the idea that I do this consistently. All three concepts are found within the idea of being enduring in the sight of God. And then I want you to notice something else he says here in this text, and that is that as we're running, we're looking at something. We're running and we have our eyes on something. He says we are fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the finisher or perfecter of our faith. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. You hear me a lot this morning talking about words, but I was kind of looking up various words that talked about it. And I looked up that word, fixing our eyes. The King James Version, I believe, just said looking to Jesus. But here was the comment by the man defining the words, by the author defining the word strong. And he said, it means to turn your eyes away from other things and fix them on something. But think about that. That's really two elements. That's why sometimes it helps to look a little closer at what these words mean. It means that because I'm fixed on this, something over here, in other words, I'm fixed on this, that I'm not distracted by that. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, because I'm turning my eyes off of this and onto this. In this case, my eyes are on Jesus. And I'm thinking about him. So when I'm running my race, and I'm thinking most of all about Jesus. Now, it doesn't mean I can't hear the cheers of those that have gone before me, that great cloud of witnesses. It doesn't mean that I can't think about anything at all except Jesus, but he is my main course. That's what it's all about. I'm fixing my eyes on him. And I'm thinking about how he ran his race. He put his complete faith in God. He ran. And when he ran through the cross, despising the shame and enduring all of the hostility he had to endure. Now that's something we need to stop and think about. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 3, the very next verse, he says, fixing your eyes. And then at verse 3, he said, you consider him. And the word consider there means you ponder this. You need to think about this now. Think about Jesus again. Think about him. And think about what he was going through. Consider him. Why should you consider Jesus? Because he endured opposition from sinful people. But most important of all is this last line, to me at least. He says, I want you to think about him so that you won't get weary and lose heart. How about you? I want to ask you a sincere question. I want you to answer it in your heart sincerely. Have you lost heart? Are you weary? Well, if you think my next line's going to be, well, shame on you. That would be like saying that if I'm running a marathon and, I don't know, let's say it's 10 miles and I'm in the 8th mile, and I'm panting and I'm sweating and I'm tired and my legs are cramping. That'd be like saying shame on you for doing that. Why? Because that's what happens when you run. I'm not saying shame on you. I'm saying that's what happens when you run a marathon. You get weary. So we need something to remind us why we're running. And we need to remember who ran it before us. And we need to remember that he succeeded and set our course. And that quite literally, we're running towards him. We're running to get to him. That's the whole point. I'm trying to get to where he is. And so I'm going to have to keep running to cross the finish line to get to where my Jesus is. So consider him, run towards him, fix your eyes on him. Now, so I'd explain. He calls him the author. It depends on your translation, but the author and finisher or perfecter of our faith. The word author probably doesn't mean exactly what you'd think it would mean there, because it conveys the idea of one who takes the lead, like a prince or a captain over an army, one who's in the lead of things. So he took the lead. He's saying that he didn't say, no offense to Brother Soma, who used to be the coach and everything, but he didn't stand over there and say, boys, run the race, play the game or whatever, because he ran it before he ever told those boys to. But Jesus ran the race before he ever asked a single one of us to run. He's done the running. That's the point that we want to get out of this text. He's the author. He took the lead in the race. He's the finisher of our race and our faith. The word the finisher, and I loved this comment, the perfecter or the finisher of our race. It was said that it means the one who raised faith to its highest perfection and set for us a perfect example. Man alive, Jesus Christ defined faith. He defined it by the way he lived, by the way he acted, how he conducted himself, even under the most difficult of situations. One thing about it, even when Jesus struggles in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's struggling with the hope of pleasing God. He's not struggling to say, I want to give in to sin. I want to give in to sin. He's struggling to keep God glorified. That's the key. And that's the thing that we all see in the nature of Jesus. Well, last of all, he says that Jesus did his race for the joy set before him. And we all understand that Jesus had to endure the cross and despise the shame to get to where he wanted to go. And that was ultimately the right hand of the throne of God. There is for all of us a heavenly joy set before us. Here's what I'd call the heavenly joy. Number one, it's the joy of knowing that if I finish this race well, I will have lived my life glorifying God. My life will have meant something to God. It will show to others what God is all about. So that's a joy in my heart. The second thing is there will be a joy in hearing, as Jesus promised, well done, thou good and faithful servant. It will be a joy to cross a finish line and know that there'll be a Lord there to receive me and say, that was a good job, my son. You did well. You were a good servant to me. That's a joy. There's a joy in thinking about, like Stephen, as he was dying, looking up and seeing the right hand of the throne of God. There's a joy in knowing that lies before you. There is a joy of thinking about eternal fellowship with God and a new order of things, and experiencing no pain, no tears, no more sin. And there's a joy of thinking about seeing great people of God who went before us. I love Jesus' statement that he made, and he said he was talking really a little negatively because he was talking about the Jews that had not listened to him and obeyed him. But he said, there's going to be people, and he's talking about the Gentiles. He says there's going to be people that are going to sit down in the kingdom of God with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're going to be on the outside. You're not going to get to come in. You who claim to love Abraham more than anybody else on the face of the earth, you who said you descended from Father Abraham, and he said you're not going to even get to be there and be with him. You'll be on the outside. You'll not be in that heavenly kingdom. And he says, but there'll be people who'll come from the east and west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now, some may just blow that away as figurative, but I take it literally. I believe we'll one day sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the other greats. All the other ones that finished the race. All the other ones that kept the faith. We could add 100 names to the list right off. We could add names perhaps from our own generation that we know that have gone before us and run the race and been successful. But it'll be a great day to sit down with all the faithful, and to sit down with the Lord and with the angels, and to sit down in the presence of God. And it'll be great to know it doesn't end in 30 minutes or a day or a month or a year. It's just 1 year. We'll always be with Him. That's the joy set before us. And there's a lot of other things we could add to that, but those things ought to suffice. If you need to obey the gospel and come today professing your faith and ready to submit to the water of baptism, we'd encourage you to act on it so that your sins can be forgiven and you can be added to the Lord's kingdom, the Lord's church. If you need to be restored, we'll pray with you in that regard. So let's be